Yat Ebene. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jessica Stago, and I'm with Change Labs. I'm the Director of Business Incubation. So Yat She Jessica Stago Shia, but Anishle do Zilka Ambashishin, Ki Ani Deshache do Zilka Andeshanale. So we're going to just go ahead and get started. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the business registration section of the agenda, and then I'll give a little description of it once we get all the introductions done. So very quickly, if I could just have, I'll start from the far end. Candice, if you could introduce yourself.
Very quickly, because Navajos are so good at that. Yate shike doshne she Candice Mendez and she and Shlont the Betlejene Bashichin Twitzotni Dashichet Kachitni Dashanala. And I come from Sabidelkai, Arizona, and I own Salt Vimo Events. Salt Vimo Events specializes in event management. We plan, produce, and execute large-scale conferences, convention, trade show, and meetings. And some of our clients are Arizona Department of Agriculture, University of California, Coconino County, ASU Construction Indian Country, Change Labs. And then currently, I am planning 2 events, the Emergent Summit with the Grand Canyon Trust in August, and the National Native Media Conference, which is with the Native American Journalists Association, which is also in August. So that's why I have bags under my eyes, because I'm planning 2 conferences. They're going to be executed 1 week apart. And I'll pass the mic over to my right.
Thank you. Alito, achumachuk na to chebe to donde inziskesi it's not Lante Sahochofayat Johnson Chahato Sihoke. I did that for Joe because Joe, there is some Choctaws that do speak Choctaw, so I wanted to know that. My name is Chad Johnson. I'm president of the Icona Group. The Icona Group is a holding company. It is actually the largest indigenous-owned equipment provider in North America. We native providers to several large OEMs like John Deere, Komatsu, Bobcat. We kind of dig in the dirt for a living, is our mainstay. So we do have offices in Canada. We just signed a joint venture with an indigenous partner in Australia. So we are, I guess we'd call global in terms of our operation. Thank you.
Good after morning. She Tony Hale and she Taban Sean don't she Bashis Chin Ki Ani Dashe Ado Torachini Dashanale. I have several businesses on the Navajo Nation, beginning with construction, data center development. I have a print shop in Albuquerque. I'm also a distributor for Active Pure, which is in this building right now. You'll see the machines outside. But I also have a business consulting company in which I help companies to register with the Navajo Nation, whether they're doing work with the nation or on the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. So what we're going to be talking about now is the business registration process, and what that means is if you operate a business on or off the reservation, there's a process that you normally go through in order to tell the government that you're a business and that you're operating within the boundaries of, it could be the state of Arizona, it could be the Navajo Nation, it could also in some places be within a city, like a Flagstaff or Winslow, but there's some sort of process that guides businesses and the governments to make sure that the governments know that you're operating within their boundaries and that you're abiding by all of the policies and the laws that they have set for businesses to operate. So that could mean, like I said, any size government. It could be, in some cases, there is a federal government registration for some industries, but it's usually the state. It could be the county, it could be a city, or and what we're going to be talking about today is with the Navajo Nation, what the business registration looks like. And so we're going to get right into the questions because I think a lot of what we would really like you all to know is will come out in some of the answers and leaning on the experience of the panelists and then just the discussions within those answers. So we're going to start with Tony since he's got the most, I think, the most experience helping businesses to get registered with the Navajo Nation. So it's well known that it takes a minimum of a couple of weeks, and that's a very minimum, to get your business registered on the Navajo Nation. As opposed to with the state of Arizona or the state of New Mexico, you can do it within hours. So why is it important to reduce the amount of time to register your business on the Navajo Nation? Tony?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. To address this question, we have to look at the process of the Business Regulatory Department within the Navajo Nation. Years ago, when I first started in the early 2000s in helping people register with the Navajo Nation, there was only one person who did that, who registered all the companies, who registered, incorporated all the businesses that came through. And today, there's still only one person. The person has changed, but there's still only one person. And the difference between the nation and the surrounding states, and I think all the states, is that we don't have an online platform in order to register. You have to, in order to speed things up, you have to create a platform in which the companies can come in and register and pay their fee all online. This process would be quicker if we could just do that and they can upload their business documents. I believe that's it.
Okay. Does anybody have any, does anybody want to share anything with regards to Tony? I do know that with Change Labs, we have a business incubator, and so the incubator is there to assist new businesses, and most of Change Labs programs is there for new businesses. Our mission is to get as many businesses as we can started on the nation. And so we run across a whole host of different issues with people getting their business registered in addition to the time that it takes. So there's issues with not having a physical address. There's issues with even understanding what a fiscal sponsor is. And Tony, you serve as a fiscal sponsor in many ways. You want to kind of explain what that is?
Yeah. Actually, I was going to mention that and forgot. But I act as a registered agent for a lot of companies that come onto the Navajo Nation to do work, or even when I help people incorporate their business, whether it's an S Corp, C Corp, or LLC. I act as a registered agent, and I think when people come on, they don't have the opportunity to find a registered agent within the Navajo Nation. Most of the times you have an attorney that will represent you as a registered agent, but you don't have to be an attorney. You just have to, as a registered agent, you have to your business has to reside on the Navajo Nation. And so I actually provide that service, and that's actually how I got started. My father was an attorney, and I wanted to start a corporation, and I asked him about a registered agent, and he said, why don't you can do it on your own. He gave me a template, I filled it out, turned it in, I was incorporated, then I did it for my cousin, then I did it for another cousin, and then I thought, hey, I can actually make money doing this. So that was my first business, was business consulting and actually helping people to start their businesses or register their businesses on the Navajo Nation. So with a registered agent, we are legally bound to know where our clients are at all times in case there's a tax issue or some sort of legal matter that needs to be taken care of. Then they would, if they can't get a hold of my client, then they call me, and I need to know where they're at all times. So, and that's what a registered agent does.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, that's a registered agent, not a fiscal sponsor. got my terms mixed up. So we'll go ahead and go on to the next question. That's going to be for Candice. What can the Navajo Nation do to encourage businesses to register on the Navajo Nation? And actually, why did you decide to get registered on the Navajo Nation with all of the obstacles that you faced?
I think I'll start with the first question, and then I'll go on to complaining for the second question. I wanted to register my business with the Navajo Nation because I really wanted to see the Navajo Nation succeed. And I grew up there, I lived there all my life, and I just saw all of the infrastructure and I can see what it can be. And I've seen what, especially with the speech that was given last night, it's amazing that we are here today. Oh, my battery went out. The feds are on to us. But I just feel like with all the cards stacked against us, we are still here today, and we are flourishing in this amazing economy, despite being denied infrastructure and schools and roads and everything. We're still able to just push through and survive as a community. So that was my biggest thing, was that I believe that one of the first times that I got to really talk with Jessica Stago was that she told me a lot of the Navajo Nation actually pays taxes to the state. And I didn't know that. I thought that we didn't pay taxes. And so when I registered with the Navajo Nation, I was very intentional about my money going to the Navajo Nation. I wanted my tax money to go to the Navajo Nations, and whether that goes to schools, whether that goes to water projects. I didn't want it to go to the state because the state money doesn't come back to us. And I just really wanted a nation to be built. I wanted to go into a store and have my Navajo food be available to me. And I wanted, when I check out, I wanted the Navajo people to speak to me in Navajo. And I wanted the children to speak in Navajo, and that is what I wanted. So I think by building this economy, I think that we can do all those things. And if I live on the Navajo Nation and I support the Navajo Nation and I try to do everything and keep it there, I think that people will start believing that this is a nation that can really be great again. I'm a history nerd by nature, and so just knowing what the Navajo Nation, Navajo people used to be prior to when this became the United States, I wanted to go back to the people we were. And to this day, one of my business models is to make sure I use Native American vendors for all my conferences. That means I source Native American printers who print all these conference brochures that you see. I make sure I source graphic designers, Native American, Navajo graphic designers. I make sure that I use Native American food caterers and vendors, Native marketing people, Native public relations. I just try to source within the Native community first, because there are some really, really talented people out there. They just don't have the exposure as the big names that you see that are so easily accessible to us. So I make it a point to try to meet and expand my network and vendors, and also it shortens the conversation. I don't have to tell a graphic designer, hey, don't put a teepee on this, okay? Or don't put a headdress on this. They already know. And same with anybody who does marketing and public relations. We don't have to have that conversation with them. They already know, and they already know what to do. And so that's why I really try to stay within the Native network for when I use my vendors for any Native conference that I do. And I think one of the biggest things, the biggest challenges of having a business on the Navajo Nation is not having access to broadband. I've had to rent an office in Delcon, Arizona for $600 a month because I want access to into a Wi-Fi that costs me $72 a month. I have satellite internet at my house, at my home office, where I have to pay up to $500 a month sometimes, and I can't even make a phone call all the time. So that alone is just in business expense and network and communications. And so I think some of the incentives the Navajo Nation can make for business owners is to lower taxes for the small businesses that make less than $1 million. Because I think with these tax rates, they want the big, large construction companies to pay those tax rates. And which they should. You know, a lot of those big construction companies that are building jails on the nation are not necessarily Native owned. So they should be paying big taxes. But I think small businesses, especially the ag community and smaller businesses like mine, we should pay less taxes. And that should be the incentive for us to own a business there. Also, I think the Navajo preference really needs to be regulated and made to be used. Like it just right now, that Navajo preference is just a mess. It's hard to access. Not to mention the bidding process. We're supposed to be able to easily access the bidding process for the nation, but we can't. If you look at the page right now, there's no bids listed, even though I know there's bids out there for construction companies. And they have private access to it because they network and they know the people. So that's not fair for other small businesses that want to get started and want to subcontract with construction companies. And even with companies like mine, I wanted to contract with the Head Start program, the Navajo Nation Head Start program. But I wasn't aware of the bidding, and they said the bid was on the Navajo Nation DED page, and it wasn't there. And of course, I went back there to hold her accountable, but that went nowhere, as you guys all know. So it's just a dead end to fight those kind of things. But I think the bidding process and the whole Navajo preference needs to be cleaned up, and it needs to be made more clear and easier to access for smaller businesses like ours. I shouldn't have to schmooze with these gatekeepers so I can have access to a bid. That's not the purpose of a private bidding, right? To bid, it has to be fair so that people won't know, like, oh, that's my friend that I met at Res, or that's my friend that I met at NIGA. A lot of smaller businesses, they can't make it all the way to these big conferences in Vegas. It's expensive. I was just at Res, and I spent so much money just to be there. And I can't imagine that smaller businesses can do the same thing. So I'm privileged that I can attend those events and grow my network, but what about the other small businesses on the Navajo Nation that can't afford to leave their businesses to attend these events and network? Again, this is something I will probably get tattooed on my forehead because you guys will hear about it all the time, and that's broadband. We absolutely need broadband. I cannot make sales if I don't have access to Square. If my phone cannot connect to the internet, I cannot make sales. If I cannot get calls from my clients while I'm driving to the gas station because I don't have great cell phone service, then that just falters. So we need absolutely access. We need access to broadband. Even when I was filing my business at the Navajo Nation DED office, to send a PDF was impossible. You couldn't send a PDF to email the person that was filing my paperwork. I had to literally take a flash drive, which I haven't owned one of those for about 10 years. I borrowed it from someone who was working there, a friend that just happened to be in the office that day. She gave me her flash drive, and I downloaded my PDF, my paperwork, onto a PDF, transferred it to her computer so she could print it, and then I gave it to the person who was filing my paperwork at DED because the internet was so terrible at the Navajo DED office. And that was in the nation's capital. That was in Window Rock, Arizona. It was not in Sabadelkai or Tisto or Delcon. That was in Window Rock, where I could not even email somebody a PDF file because there was just not enough bandwidth to send that off and for them to get it. They'll probably take them like 2 hours. So I think in order to attract more businesses, you need broadband. What are you going to do without it? It's like you need it to communicate. It's a form of communication now. And the fact that we still don't have it is a really scary situation that we have. And especially if you live out in rural areas like I do, we don't have access to 911. And, you know, on days when I'm on my days off, I tell my family, hey, I'm going to go out and ride my horse. If I don't come back, look for me, you know, because I just don't access to 911. Like, you know, if something happens and nobody, you know, how is somebody going to find me? Even my phone doesn't have GPS on there, out there. So broadband, I think, is essential for economic growth. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Candice. So there were a lot of challenges that Candice mentioned, and I just want to kind of go back to what the speaker was saying this morning, Mr. Austin, about using sovereignty as the standing on sovereignty, and then from there we can bridge out and solve other problems that would eventually lead to solving some of the social issues, even the social issues that Candice mentioned, about not having 911 and not having a safe environment all the time, and not having access to those things. And the thing is the access, right? It's like, how do we, is that our people shouldn't have to live without access to vital services. As everybody else in the world has access, we should also have that same kind of access. So, Chad, I'm going to move to you, and I know that your company has registered with many different tribes across the country, and also want to welcome you to the Navajo Nation. But you struggled with registering your business on Navajo. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit, but I'd like to, right before that, and go on what both the Austins had talked about last night and this morning. When you talk about nations, and you talk about nations, how they generate wealth, right? You have federal businesses, so your federal entities that create revenue streams, you have taxation, and then you have economic engines. Economic engines in the sense of small businesses, even outside of where they're able to go outside of their territory and bring dollars back into their nation. So it is critical for those small businesses to be in a position to be successful. You'll hear me talk about entrepreneurship all day long. So the speed of registration, as you talked about, is critical. Because you know, as small businesses, you've got things like payroll, cash flow, things like that impact you, that can be detrimental to you running your business. So it's critical that you're able to move quickly. It's a plus and a minus for being a small business. Your ability to be agile and move through processes. Broadband, the ability to bill, to reach out to customers, to be more than, be bigger than just one person, right? It allows you to have a broader reach to grab customers and bring back in. Without it, it's a struggle, and it takes longer. Dollars take longer to come back in. So of the 574 nations, we are certified one way, Trero, Treco, CISO, P1, P2, with a little over 250 plus. And it's important for us because it's not just working inside of it, it's also working with the individual operators and farmers and ranchers, producers inside of those nations. So we've taken that commitment to say, okay, we're going to, actually was at a Chaco Canyon conference a couple years ago, there was an attorney in there that said, we could not work with all 574. I said, challenge accepted. So we went about this, so we're halfway there. So we're gonna go after all 570, so hopefully here in the next couple years, we'll be able to register with all 574. But so I wanted to bring to that process of registration. The length of time, and I'll put it in comparison. Earlier I said that we just signed a joint venture in Australia. We registered our company in another country, 16-hour flight away, faster than we were able to get our P2 registration here in Navajo Nation. And this was with attorneys, this is with we have a team that just does registrations. That's all they do is travel outreach. That's all they do. And it was longer to register here than it was to register a business in Australia. And that was actually in a tribal jurisdiction. So the Larrakia people was registering inside of their tribal lands. It took longer to go through that process. And I couldn't imagine, I said, some of you guys see this, right? You've got individual businesses just starting off and they're wanting to operate, or even you with your incubator, right? How do you get through that? Because that is what is needed. The small business entrepreneurship is needed for nation to act like nations, as Dr. Austin had said this morning. Those economic engines to go outside, to be able to generate revenue, and to be able to generate it quickly is imperative. It is absolutely imperative. And it's one of the reasons that so many businesses fail is speed, access to capital, access to the resources, access to the markets. They don't get enough, they don't have enough, there's not enough dollars for them to survive that long period of time. So the process, it took an awful long time, and we had a lot of people working on it. That was what was so crazy. And even of those 250 plus that we're registered with, some are faster, some were slower. I think when the registration process, when nations look at their preferred vendor programs, you mentioned it earlier, what do you do from an accountability perspective? Is it used to stimulate your small businesses? Not to be the feeder, right? Not to be the handout to those small businesses, but what are they doing to help stimulate, to help grow those small businesses? And the ability to get your registration quickly is key for that.
Wow, that's amazing. Originally, Joe said, you know, Chad's registered his business on hundreds of nations. And then I thought, there can't be hundreds of nations. I'm going to change hundreds to many. Now you're over 200. So now I understand that of the 574 tribes across the nation, you're trying to get your business registered in every single tribal nation in the United States. That's amazing.
I argue, I don't see Joe in here, but I argue with attorneys a lot. So when this attorney stood up and said, you can't do that, I took it as a challenge. So, and we also work with First Nations in Canada, we work with First Nations in South America, and then Australia and New Zealand too. So it's not just, but when I'm speaking about our registration is here in the US, right, specifically. And some are good, some are, you know, there's no accountability for some of them. Great, you're certified, great, you're registered as a preferred vendor or a native-owned vendor or whatever it is. The ones that are really is where there's a relationship between the small businesses and it's not seen as this competition where you're competing against with the tribal businesses, right? You're seen as an asset because you can go outside, right? You can go outside as an economic engine. I'm from Houston, so you'll see Houston with the oil and gas companies, right? They have so many oil and gas companies that go outside of Houston and bring foreign direct investment back in. Right, these are economic engines that bring dollars back to their origins. That's how these small businesses can operate too. You know, with our tribe, Choctaw Nation manufactures electric vehicles. We sell those electric vehicles, right? We issued them a purchase order for 1,000 units, right? That's 3 years worth of production capacity. That's 3 years worth of jobs. That's how you work together with a tribal nation, right? There's ways to work and not seem as competition. We are better at selling than they are, so convincing, but they're good at manufacturing. We'll let them do what they're good at, let us do what we do. There are ways to work through that, but things like the registration process, things like access to broadband, access to capital is a huge, huge issue. These large banks, it's insane. The entrepreneurship programs that they have, so many other socio-demographic groups that are out there, they're included in entrepreneurship programs. We are not. We can't go to JP Morgan Chase or Bank of America. There's only so far that a CDFI or a tribal bank can go, and then you say, okay, where do you go from there, right? I need a $25 million line of credit, right? Or I need a $50 million bonding capability. That is something that also, in terms of access to broadband, is access to capital, real access to capital. We have to own our own money. And what I mean, own our own financial institutions. Sorry, I'll get on my sandstone.
Oh, thank you.
Question for, are you a foreign entity on the Navajo Nation or Jew? Oh, okay,
We're P2.
Oh, okay, that's what I wanted to know. If I just wanted to comment on the economic engines that he was talking about, and this is something that I discovered when I was working on the ranch during COVID because we couldn't do events. I worked with my uncle during the summer, last summer, just buying and selling cattle. And he said in the 80s, they did, he just pulled all together. He was bored one day and he had his sisters doing, they were going to school at ASU and they had the summer off. So he decided to pull together, this is in the 80s, by the way. He pulled together all of the grazing permits, just from the Pinion Grazing District, which was District 4, and from my area, District 7, and he pulled all the grazing permits, and they tallied all the numbers of just the livestock allowed on those grazing permit numbers. And we all know that we don't always report all of our numbers. So these are minimum numbers I want to show you guys. So in the 80s, the Navajo people had, in capital, 120,000 head of sheep. And they had 60,000 cattle and 20,000 horses. And in the 80s, the sheep, on average, they ran about $60 a head. $25 for mutton, and about lambs went from about $64 to $250 a head. So you multiply $60 a head by 120,000, you have 7.2 million in just sheep capital. For cattle, you had 60,000 sheep, and then I averaged it to about $550 a head. You know, it was up and down in the 80s. It went from like $450 all the way up to $800 a head, but we just did a conservative number of 550 a head. That's 33 million in cattle. For horses, we had about 20,000, and horses were pretty expensive in the 80s, and they ran about $300 a head, and that's $6 million. And that is just from 2 districts in the Navajo Nation. That's from Pinion and District 7, District 4, District 7. You add all that up, that's $46.2 million in the 80s, just from those 2 districts. There's 11 districts in the Navajo Nation, and in the 80s, this is just from the census, I don't know if everybody's uncles and aunties were counted, but in the 80s, the population for the Navajo Nation was 138,000. You divide that by 11 districts, so there are about 12,000 people living in each district. And you divide 46 million by 12,000 people, that's $4,000 per person that each Navajo had in capital and livestock in the 80s. And that doesn't even count for the wool or mohair that was being sold. And that, I think we came out to 2 to 3 million for wool and mohair, just for Pinion. This wasn't for District 7. So that's close to $50 million in capital and livestock in the 80s for these families. And it kind of makes you think, you're like, my parents, my grandmas, my grandparents, they made a living off of being ranchers. And you guys probably all grew up with the same thing. You know, we were like, oh yeah, we all grew up, we weren't poor. We had cattle and we had horses and we had sheep. But nowadays, that no longer exists because the infrastructures and those same things are not supported for these ranchers and businesses. They were told to go off the reservation and get real jobs and make far less than $4,000 per person. They were getting basically nothing to work on these railroads and everything when they had all this wealth on the Navajo Nation. And so now that has been wiped out, the workforce has been wiped out, and the infrastructure and the programs that used to exist for agricultural programs are no longer there. And also just the family structure has been broken down as well. Families no longer have 10 kids of free labor, including myself. There's no, you don't have like your in-laws come in to help and shear 300 head of sheep by hand. Nowadays, we barely do 26. I know I barely do 26, and I have electric shears. So that's just the amount of like economic engines that the Navajo Nation just ignored and let go and didn't foster, is at this $50 million a year. This is only in 1 year of grazing permit holders. And these are very conservative numbers. These are numbers that were taken down for the sake of the BIA. So who knows how much more animals were out there that got sold. And these are just animals sold through programs of the Navajo Nation. These are not animals taken off the reservation to like Holbrook or Farmington or Cortez to be sold. Those numbers didn't get counted. So we don't even know what the true number is, but we know that this is the conservative number. So it's really encouraging to know that at one point, this was an insane amount of wealth for us people, and we were able to actually make a living off of just agriculture. And we competed with, ranchers from Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, and we were a force to be dealt with, but it's all been let go because businesses are just not supported like they used to be, especially for ag business.
Thank you, Candice. And I think that it's also worth noting that what we're talking about is that when you don't define your own sovereignty, then the government takes over and pushes you toward other activities. So we were basically forced to give up that way of life, give up all of that economic input and those economic engines that worked for us in order for wage jobs. And what we know is there isn't enough money to feed all of us. We saw that through the pandemic. We saw that. We've been seeing that through these decades that they don't pay us enough to feed ourselves. And so we have to go back to defining what our own economic engines are going to be and putting resources in and investments into those activities. And so I'm going to ask the panelists just to give a final closing statement, but I wanted to just kind of go back to some of what we learned about the challenges of registering your business, why you should register your business. We have, if you look at the census, there's not many businesses on the Navajo Nation. Although when you go into our communities, everywhere you look, you see somebody selling something. You see people providing services. So there's many, many, many businesses out there that are not registered. And how that hurts us is that we don't know, the government doesn't know that. And we've heard from government officials that our people are not, they're not interested in business, or they're not entrepreneurs, or they're risk averse. And we had to sort of fight back against that and say, no, that's not true. You can go to any dirt road and you'll see a sign for something: window tinting, haircuts, tire repair. And you see people who are hitchhiking to work. That's the risk that they're taking. And so all of those narratives come from, trying to colonize us, trying to make us who we are not. And so we had to really do a lot of that work with Change Labs, and now we're saying, okay, entrepreneurs are standing up all over the nation. They're wanting to come back home. They're trying to figure out a way to get back. So now our support is, how do we make that happen? How do we work with the governments to do that? And we have to really get serious about the registration process and making it easier, because if we don't have broadband, we can't get our businesses registered in a timely fashion. And if you're a business owner, you're not going to spend the time. You don't have the time or the resources to spend on something like a business registration. So that's what it comes down to, and that's one of the reasons the major obstacle is broadband, but then the process within the nation, all the people it takes to get your business registered and to become priority businesses, those are things that we need to rethink. So I'm going to go ahead and go back and see if the panelists want to give a closing statement or any final thoughts. Anybody? Tony?
I'll say something. When you register your business on the Navajo Nation, there are several ways that you can go about it. If you're going to incorporate a business, whether it's an LLC, S Corp, or C Corp, you can go and do that with the nation. I believe the nation's been incorporating businesses since 1985. So you can do that. A foreign company can come in and register with the Navajo Nation and bring in their paperwork. And you can register with the nation and do business on the nation. But in order to get on the priority listing, whether it's a priority 1 or priority 2, there are several steps that you need to take. Probably the most important is registering with the tax commission office as well, Form 100. And then your business plan, of course, is an obstacle that most small businesses run into. For example, there was a welding company that wanted to get on the priority list, and somebody from RBDO called me and said, "Can you write this business plan?" And I said, "Of course." So I wrote the business plan for this gentleman, and he was then put on the list. And come to find out that he's been waiting to get on the list for 6 years, and all he needed was his business plan. But he was an older gentleman, and he didn't know how to write a business plan. So I wrote a business plan within a couple of days, and he was he was off and running. So those kinds of obstacles, those kinds of things, people like Change Labs, and you can even call the Dene Chamber of Commerce, and we can guide you to people that can help you, like myself, to register and that know the system inside and out, and we can assist you in all of those documentations and make the road a little smoother instead of washboard. Thank you all. Yeah.
So just real quick, just about the registration and kind of what you were talking about, where there is a lack of lists in this country. You mentioned reaching out to other Native subcontractors, right? There is not a central repository in this country that has a list of Native companies or Native businesses anywhere. There's not a centralized list. Matter of fact, if you reach out to what the National Minority Development Center, I'm not going to get into that, but their old MBE certification, they only think there's 300 and 350 plus Native businesses in this country, right? That's their opinion. That's what they have registered. And so that's why I think the registration process is important, because it does provide a list, right? It does provide a list that it does not, a centralized, even though it's not centralized, a list are hard to come by for Native businesses, right? So like we're in the process of looking for technicians, diesel engine technicians, folks that know how to work on ag equipment, tractors, excavators, backhoes, mining equipment, right? Where do I go and find those? You know, how did you find a lot of your subcontractors? You know, it's you call somebody, your friends or your colleagues that you know. You met some people at Res, but you can't go pull a central repository. And we do this across the country, and it's a struggle. So one of the first things that we do is we reach out to the local nation that we're trying to do work on and say, do you guys have your Taro list or your Treco list or your P1 or P2 list, to try to find those subcontractors. So I just want to say it is important from that side too, because it gives you that visibility. It gives visibility to you, it gives visibility to your business. Thanks.
I just want to go off what he said about a centralized list for Native businesses. If you look at the Navajo Nation preference list on the website, it's a PDF form. So you have to like print it off, and you can't even copy paste it or convert it to Google Docs because it's the kind of list that's scanned. It's not like you made it it's not coded is what I'm trying to say. So it's really archaic. And the really big challenges for Navajo businesses to register with the minority businesses or with ADOT minority or any of those minority programs, 8A zoning, any of those hub zone 8A programs is really hard. Even to register my business with SAMS.gov is hard because I have to use my Navajo Nation physical address, which is basically directions to my house. And every time I loathe having to register my business with those programs because I have to go through the phone tree, and it's about a good 2-hour conversation. So just sit down with a cup of coffee and then keep asking for a tribal representative because they don't know how to enter a physical address. And it's usually just as easy as them just pressing enter. But they are just so caught up with trying to get a physical address from me that they cannot understand what it means to live on the Navajo Nation. And that goes with banks too. When I had my first big check, I went from bank to bank, like Pretty Woman, telling them like, listen, I got money to spend in here. I went to all these conferences and I got all these these business cards from these banks that do business with with tribal nations. And those same banks to open up a bank account, and they wouldn't take my Navajo Nation tax ID. They wouldn't even take my physical address. And they said, sorry, we don't do that. And so the only person, and at the time, I was trying to divest from Wells Fargo. But Wells Fargo is the only one that knew exactly what to do with my Navajo Nation tax ID and my address and I forced that guy at the Phoenix Wells Fargo to submit my paperwork. I told him, I was like, there's a Wells Fargo in Window Rock, Arizona, and I know for a fact they take Navajo Nation ID. So I made that banker call a teller in Window Rock, Arizona, and made him, and the guy's like, all you have to do is press enter. And he's like, really? He's like, yeah, just press enter, it'll go through. And so it's just hang-ups like that people just like, they can't see beyond their own American minds. So all they needed to just was press enter and then to make my bank application come through. And I was pressed for time because I had this big check. I had like rent due, and I was panicking because my credit card was about to get maxed out, and none of these banks would cash my check. And I was in near frustration tears because I needed this money. And so Wells Fargo was the only one that could really take my money because of, that teller who was very patient with the guy in Phoenix and the guy that I opened the bank account with was Navajo in Phoenix. And he talked to another teller in Window Rock about it. But I think just in closing, I just want to say that I do want to go back to this economic drive we had in the 80s, where we had almost $50 million in ag sales just in 2 districts. And that was when families were self-reliant, and that was a good exercise of sovereignty. And we had our own money and our own wealth, and that's why the border towns existed, and that's how they got rich. All these car dealerships existed because of all this wealth accumulated just from the ag industry in the 80s. And so that's just all I want, is just to encourage you guys and let you guys know that money used to be there, and that economic engine used to be there, and I think it can be there again if we get a lot of work done here today.
Kat, thank you.